morning, I'm WaywornWyrm, and welcome to my channel. And welcome to episode 1 of a new series called Astra Imperia. We are going into episode 1, First Steps. Captain Elebe Merek lazily punched in a couple of commands into the console next to her. It wasn't her normal console. That one was currently being used as a footrest. The view screen at the front of the bridge showed a close-up of the planet of Owei, with various landmasses and lakes slowly drifting by. So far, they had discovered that Owei had a very thin carbon dioxide atmosphere, less than a quarter than what her home planet of Owei had, but it had at least a tenth of the thickness. The surface of the planet was hot, but that was to be expected when the planet sat on the inner edge of the green zone. Owei, on the other hand, sat on the opposite edge of that zone. Less than 1/4 of the planet was covered in liquid water, probably a result of the thin atmosphere and high temperatures. The scans were about 3/4 done, but she was disappointed to note that so far absolutely no life had been found, not even microbial. Once she was sure of that fact, she was planning on having the Prometheus land on the planet to collect some samples and give her crew some R&R on the planet. Not that the R&R would be great. If they went outside, they would have to stay in suits. Not only was the atmosphere way too thin for comfort, but it was unbreathable. But she was looking forward to being the first person to ever step foot on another planet. Well, okay. First person if you discounted all the old legends and myths about how thousands and thousands of years ago, her people were part of a spacefaring civilization. And Elebe did discount those stories. Even a fleet command didn't. Other than the stories that had been passed down for longer than anyone could remember, there's not a single shred of evidence that had ever been found supporting those stories. And she could understand why Fleet Command would act as though the stories were true, no matter what they actually believed. If they were true, then there were other, potentially hostile aliens out there somewhere, and the Navy had to be prepared. Hell, even her ship, which was a ship of science and exploration, had 12 main lasers mounted in 4 arcs around the ship, and 24 secondary lasers mounted dorsally and ventrally. Fleet Command was not fucking around when it came to the deeply held cultural ideas about the existence of aliens. And she was sure that the war that had just ended before the dawning of the space age, and that had brought the population from billions down to hundreds of millions, factored into that. Almost everyone in Fleet Command had come up in the water navies of Owei during a life-and-death struggle that played out on a global scale. But that struggle was over now, and the planet was united for the first time. Sure, that unity came from the fact that if they hadn't, the remaining population was so small compared to what it had been, her species quite possibly would have gone extinct. But, nevertheless, it was unified. Elebe grew up in the ruins of the former civilizations, so while this relatively recent chapter in history surrounded her every moment of every day growing up, she was detached from the actual horrors of the war that happened before she was born. And now that a second generation of post-war children were being born, they would have even more of a disconnect from it. It was quickly fading into the cultural past. The console that was at her side caught her attention by flashing over and over again. Looking at it and briefly reading what was on the screen, she saw that the computer was calling the bioscans complete. Owei had no life on it. Sitting up in her chair and moving her main console into position as what it was designed for rather than as a footrest, she looked at her bridge crew. Commander Alice, start looking for a place to land. The computer reports that Lieutenant Commander Kastner is finishing his scans of the planet, and his instruments are reporting no life on the planet. Aye, Captain, replied the sensor officer. Lieutenant Sokolov, once Lieutenant Commander Alice has found a place to set down, I need you to safely plot the course. The atmospheric and topological data is long since completed, so you should have everything you need to complete that plot. Once she was done with him, she turned to her console and punched in commands to open communications with the science lab. Commander, I've been informed that the bioscans have completed with negative results. From the console came a reply. Aye, Captain, I just got the results back. The computer is not 100% certain, given the scans are not fully complete, but there's a very high probability that there's no life below us. Good. Lieutenant Commander Alice is currently using our normal sensors to find a spot to set down. Lieutenant Sokolov will be plotting a course down there as soon as he's given a destination. I plan on setting down tomorrow. Will that be enough time for your scans to finish? The sound of rustling filled the console for several seconds, as well as the hmms and haws, and other sounds of someone who is looking over several types of data to put it all together. Yes, I believe that would be good. Now that the bioscans are complete, we're most of the way done with the actual scans. Mostly what is left is studying the makeup of the geology to get an idea of how resource-rich the planet is. Obviously, I would love to set foot on Ilea. I'll make sure my staff is able to get what you need done. Thank you, Commander, Elbe said before she closed the connection. Looking back up at her helmsman and sensor officers. Okay, you heard that. The two of you have until tomorrow to figure out where we're going to land and how we're going to get there. I'm sure that the Lieutenant Commander would prefer the place you chose to be next to a river delta, preferably one that dumps into whatever passes for oceans down there. That should give the largest diversity in every form in the smallest area. Sadly, biodiversity is not going to be one of those things. She got up and looked at her first officer. Commander Norling, you have the bridge. She waited for his nod, and she left the bridge. The next morning saw Captain Merek becoming the first person to ever set foot on another planet. The ground crunched under her boot, and she looked around at a scene that seemed both familiar and completely alien. They landed almost a kilometer away from the farthest edge of the river delta, to a point where Lieutenant Commander Alice and Lieutenant Sokolov were sure that the ground could handle the weight of their ship. As such, the delta was not visible from where she stood, but the ocean, a similar distance away, sure was. It was blue, but of a much weaker tint than she was used to, almost as if the painter had thinned their paint too much when painting the water. If this were a picture, of course. The sky was also a different color. Down by the horizon, it was very blue, more blue than any sky she had ever seen. But that quickly faded to increasingly dark, starting not too many degrees above the horizon. With no life, there was no green, or really any other color. Just shades of browns and reds and other rock-like colors. Her visor was down, muting the colors she did see because of how much more intense the sun was this close to it. She could only imagine how wonderful the sky would look if the atmosphere was of a decent thickness. She watched as several other members of her crew slowly filed out behind her, led by Commander Kastner, who she imagined looked like a kid on Christmas morning. Not that she could see his face through the visor, to be sure. In some ways, walking around was more freeing than being on the ship, but not in every way. Sure, the sightlines were so much farther, and the distance you could go in any direction was vastly greater than the Prometheus could offer. But in her experience, no matter how much time you spent in the suit, you could never quite forget it was there, holding you tight. They had functionally infinite air on the ship for the suit, so she was plenty happy to allow her entire crew turns out and about on the planet, while Kastner and his crew collected as many samples as they could. In fact, she was sure that he was going to set out with about half of his science crew in a few minutes to make the hike over to the Delta. Holly Maximov's stomach was doing flips as she stood in line for the Airbus. Slung over her shoulder was a duffel bag that held everything that she owned, not including the clothes on her back, of course. It was really amazing how fast the government got 11 million people together to ship them off to this new planet. The Prometheus had apparently only reported in a couple of days before, and now here she was, part of the first group that would travel to Ilea to live. This ship, the freighter Airbus, would bring them there, and the engineers who were a part of this group would start construction on the first domes they would live under. The brochure she was given said something about the atmosphere not being breathable. She didn't fully understand it, but she only joined because this was a chance at a new life. She would be a manager at one of the restaurants that would be opening to support the miners who would make up the bulk of the settlement. A stray thought of terror flitted through her brain as she shuffled forward. The thought told her to jump out of line and run. What was she doing? Going to live on another planet? That was certifiably insane. No one had ever done that before. Hell, before a few days ago, no one had even ever set foot on another planet. And here she was going to go live on one. The rational part of her brain said it was too late to back out now. Anyway, even if it wasn't, she had nothing left to go back to. She'd given up the lease on her apartment and quit her job. She would be jobless and homeless, with nowhere to turn to change those quickly. And even if she hadn't done any of those things, her life wasn't much before this. A single waitress who lived in a shitty apartment in a shitty area of one of the largest cities on the side of Owei. Not only was she not losing much by giving that all up, but society wasn't losing much either. At the end of this journey, she would have a home that she owned and a job that paid more than enough to live. Given that this was a space thing, international laws applied, so she would get a basic income regardless of job, free healthcare, free education, free air, free water, and vouchers for food. Okay, so of course they weren't really free per se. She would have to pay about half of her income in taxes to cover it, but the half that she would retain would be more than enough to live comfortably. Looking around at the few 100,000 people who would make up this new settlement, waiting in line with her, she was sure that every single one of them was thinking similar things. And most of them had signed up to work in the mines, which would be much harder work than she would have to deal with. They would probably have to wear spacesuits all the time. The 11 million people who would make up the new population of Ilea would be settled in 12 different cities across the planet. So in case of catastrophe, the city affected could be temporarily resettled in one or more of the other cities, while the powers that be decided what to do with that city. With every step forward, the ship became larger in front of her, until eventually, she walked up the large ramp into the cargo hold. Looking up, all she could think of was how industrial the ship looked. The cargo bay took up most of the interior, with gangways around the edges. Though she couldn't really see much of this large interior, because there was a large, clearly temporary Great Lake floor not too far above her. It was clear that the temporary habitations that were built throughout the large space were very nice and clean, but she couldn't help but think of rat warrens. 2 days later, she was still thinking that the multiple layers were all rat warrens. People were living their lives around her and seemed to be making the freighter their homes, even though they'd be leaving in less than 2 more days. Children ran almost non-stop through the myriad streets that formed between the small habitats. Someone had apparently brought a clothesline and somehow found the water and soap to start washing their clothes, with the line attaching to Holly's hab. It was really sinking in now. She was not the only person who was desperately leaving behind everything they had ever known to start a new life, because there was little to nothing to leave behind. Almost every single person on this ship was in the same boat. Metaphorically, of course. They weren't the cream of the crop, the best possible colonists their government could send. They were just a mass of people who wouldn't be missed, who could hopefully make it, spreading their species throughout the system. Holly had no doubt that this colonization effort would be the first of many to come, and the success or failure of future expansions would depend on this ragtag group of societal dregs. Not that any of this dour thinking would get her anywhere. She laid back out on the cot she had and opened her old paperback up and started reading once more. Dr. Patricia McEwan watched the ball come back down toward her open hands, feeling the weight of the rubber as it hit, and then tossed it back in the air. She was leaning back in her office chair, tossing a rubber ball up in the air and catching it over and over again. The large wooden desk in front of her had a slim computer monitor on it, and a keyboard in a pull-out shelf, her cup of tea sitting nearby, and the rest of the desk was covered in papers. A large band of space on the walls, broken only by windows and the door, was taken up by computer-integrated writing surfaces, and most of the space was covered by various equations and information on various tensile strengths of different materials. Even the ceiling was covered by a giant computer readout, covered with more of the same as the walls. Last month, one of the engineers who had worked with the Republic Navy had submitted a paper that pointed toward a way to build more efficiently. He clearly had the start of an idea, but had quickly found himself out of his depth, something that he had the good graces to admit in the paper. As the paper had begun to circulate among the engineers of the Navy, and a little bit into the academic circles, somewhere along that way, it had impressed someone enough that it eventually landed on Pat's desk. In fact, it reached her desk from above. As the head of the United Republic of Owei's official government research center, she had been ordered to look into the paper and submit a feasibility report. So, she had dedicated some time to that report and reading through the paper. Honestly, she had imagined that it would be a semi-interesting read, and then life would go on unchanged, because she was sure that somewhere in the paper the author must have made a mistake that led him down a false path. She ended up having to submit a report with the gist of, if he had made a mistake, she sure as hell couldn't find it. That's how she found herself taking a crash course in material science, tossing a rubber ball. The entire research center was currently dedicated to this. Pat was pretty sure that at the end of this, when they had completed wherever the paper was going, there wouldn't be any direct benefit to anything. No applications that could be started that day. But that was rarely how science worked anyway. This would push understanding forward a bit, and then someone would come along and realize with this new understanding there was a new way of doing, well, something. She wasn't sure what that something would be yet. It wasn't surprising that the next start of innovation in construction was coming out of the Navy. So far, they were the only game in town building out in space. The only ones building in both vacuum and zero-G. Well, technically it was full gravity, but in free fall, which was effectively the same thing as zero-G. As far as building things went, the Republic Navy was the cutting edge. And something about that didn't quite sit right with her. The idea that the military was at the cutting edge of science and something other than weapons and other ways to kill people just rubbed her the wrong way. Although, most of that building was to build ships to kill things in space, so on the balance, it might just even out. Admiral Si'di Culfury sat on the flag bridge of the HRS Munswell, the flagship of the First Fleet. Looking around the rather cramped room, he chuckled slightly at how grandiose that sounded. The flag bridge was originally supposed to be the secondary mess, but was retrofitted when it became clear that For at least the moment, the Munswell would be the only Munswell class made. On top of that, the Munswell was a frigate class of ship, not a battleship or a carrier like all the other flagships of the wet navies that Si'di had and the rest of the officer corps had cut their teeth on and rose through the ranks of. And the cherry on top of the stark realities of the space branch of the Navy was that the First Fleet was 4 ships that had never been far from their home planet. He commanded 1 Munswell-class frigate and then 3 Charon-class corvettes. It was hardly large enough to call his group a flotilla, let alone give it the designation of a fleet. Not that he would complain out loud about the designation, as fleet required an admiral to command it, which made him the first commander of a space group. No matter what the history of the United Republic would be, Si'di would have his spot in the history books as the first commanding officer for the space branch of the Navy, which he imagined would eventually grow to eclipse the wet Navy. As the First Fleet grew, Si'di would stay as its commander, and eventually, as multiple fleets were needed, Si'di would be the obvious choice to become the first admiral, commanding from Fleet HQ. All that Si'di needed to do to get that spot was put up with a flag bridge unworthy of that title. Best of all, he didn't even really have to bother with the crew of the Munswell. There was a commander for that. And he got his pick of command staff. With so few commander and captain positions in what most assumed would become the most prestigious branch, Si'di was finding that he was having over 100 applications per opening he needed filled. All in all, it wasn't too bad, even if his quarters were only 2 square meters. Not too long ago, he had taken the fleet out on its shakedown cruise for a couple of months, and they had filled every square inch with food. At the start of the trip, the floors in every hallway had a layer of canned food covering it to walk on. Si'di had first thought that he'd be glad when the cans became more manageable, but as the cruise went on, he found that he didn't mind walking on cans, and since it was a clear sign of how low their food was getting, he ended up missing them when they were gone. Now that they were sitting parked in orbit near the orbital construction yards, they only took a week or two's worth of food at any given time. It was not an issue to dock with the yards and even give the crews some shore leave. The yards were supplied by short-range shuttles from the planet's surface, and in the worst-case scenario where something disastrous happened and no supplies would be coming and no shuttles were at dock with the yards, simulations showed that the First Fleet could fill itself with most of the crew of the yards and probably make it through the atmosphere in a one-way trip. Although too much would have to go wrong before then, including the 2 Prometheus-class science ships, which were built for atmospheric flight, would have to be out of commission for some reason. It was an option, and it was something that the helmsman had trained for in simulation. Right now, it was all about drilling and simulations for the crews of all 4 ships under Si'di's command. It was decided that as the Prometheus-class science ships explored the solar system in depth, it would be best to remain close to Owei to give maximum operational flexibility, including staying at the planet to protect it if needed. So they trained, and Si'di frequently had conferences with the Admiralty trying to think of new situations that might happen. In fact, there was an entire small department of people whose entire job was to come up with alien spaceship designs to present the crew with. So far, the crews had the hardest time with a class the department had designated the Maru class, which was a class quickly becoming known for its ambushes. Thank you so much for listening to the first episode of Astra Imperia. Tune in next time, when the next episode of this will go live next Wednesday with episode 2, Growing Pains. And tomorrow, I should have another Let's Play up. It will either be more Battle Brothers, or maybe we'll go back to RimWorld. We haven't done that in a while. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.